bios speak Their bios speak for themselves, but this is a truly stellar lineup of people who have devoted their impressive careers to public service and advocacy on voting rights and election reform, and so many other critical issues as well. There has been a lot of discussion on BOE reform in recent months and weeks, including a timely series airing on New York One this week. I'm so excited to hear what our panelists have to say about why election administration matters, their proposed solutions, and how we can work together to make it happen. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention a few key dates and events that are coming up. First of all, this Friday, October 8th, is the deadline to register to vote in advance of the general election. Absentee ballot requests must be received by the Board of Elections by October 18th. Early voting runs from October 23rd to the 31st, and Election Day is November 2nd. DemocracyNYC and several partners are hosting a series of multilingual workshops about the upcoming election and what is on the ballot, with the first one in Spanish tomorrow evening. We are going to drop some information in the chat about these workshops, as well as some other links, including a Google Doc that has a lot of resources in it, including a social media toolkit for the upcoming general election. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our moderator for today's panel, DeNora Getachew, who currently serves as CEO of Do Something and has worked extensively in her impressive career on issues of election reform and voting rights. Thank you so much for joining us today, DeNora.
Thank you, Laura. And it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here in such great company on this Wednesday afternoon to talk about an issue near and dear to my heart, one that I've dedicated my career to. I'm DeNora Getachew, as Laura said, the CEO of Do Something, a 28-year-old nonprofit dedicated to activating young people for social impact. Never in my time and working on democracy issues, which dates back almost 2 decades ago when I was a baby lawyer, as I like to say, at the City Council, have I seen so much attention and energy focused on such an important, yet sometimes wonky topic like reforming the Board of Elections and really improving election administration. I'm so honored to have the pleasure to be here this afternoon with such esteemed and experienced colleagues who have fought long and tirelessly to improve election administration and make sure that we have a functioning and thriving democracy. And so I want to take a minute to introduce all of the panelists who you'll get a chance to hear from shortly. We have the Honorable Liz Krueger, a New York State, is that senator? I don't know, sorry, I got the wrong notes, New York State senator, but I don't know the district. I know it's across from where I live, but welcome, Senator Krueger. We have my good friend and colleague, Chisun Lee, Deputy Director, Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. We have Xamayla Rose, the Deputy Public Advocate for Civic and Community Empowerment. And we have the Honorable Nily Rozic, New York State Assembly Member from District 25. We hope to be joined shortly by the Honorable Dr. Hazel Dukes, President of the New York State NAACP Conference. But as we kick off this conversation, right, I think, as Laura said, it was so fascinating to me that every time I turn on New York One, I hear my former colleague and New York One reporter, Courtney Gross, talking about what's at stake and what needs to be done to reform the Board of Elections. And this moment feels different. You know, as I like to say, democracy is a full contact sport, and that's one that we all have to participate in. And so Senator Krueger, tell us why election administration, what is election administration and why does it matter?
Thank you so much. And I am thrilled to be in an all-women panel talking about voting. You know, sometimes we get caught in believing if we just pass the right laws to make sure everyone can vote, it'll all be okay. And it's nice for us to believe that, and it's critical that we do that. But guess what? If we actually aren't operating our boards of elections and our election days in a way that ensure everyone actually does have access, everyone actually can get to vote, and everyone's vote counts, it doesn't matter how good or bad our laws are, we flunk the test. And in my opinion, for too many years here in New York City, even as we proudly highlighted all the progressive agenda issues we had on voter rights, and it's a good agenda, we weren't paying enough attention to the fact that everyone knew every single election day in New York City would lead us to some expose a day or two later about major things that went wrong. And I'm getting old now, DeNora, and it's true every single election day. So I do believe you're right. It is time. It is past time for us to fix the fundamental problem of how we run the elections in New York City by modernizing a 21st century Board of Election. And that's why I'm very proud to be working with my colleague in the Assembly, Nily Rozic, and many of my colleagues in both houses to try to get a change in the law to redirect how we operate elections in the city. And I suspect it's needed statewide. The Senate's down on a series of statewide hearings, but I decided to just bite off New York City as my first effort, and I couldn't have a better partner in crime for that than Nily Rozic.
Thank you for that. It's right. That is the clarion call, right? It's past time, right? And so we shouldn't hopefully have another conversation with this all-star democracy cast next year, having the conversation again. Chisun, I want to turn it over to you. What are some of the challenges we've experienced with election administration in New York City in recent years, to the senator's point?
Yeah, thank you so much, DeNora. And I couldn't be more excited to be talking about all of this. I think that some of the challenges we've seen just over the past decade are all too familiar to everybody tuning in. But just to tick them off, we've had hours-long lines at certain polling sites. We have had eligible registered voters removed from the rolls and unable to vote. We've had widespread, repeated access problems for the many New Yorkers with limited English proficiency and the many New Yorkers who need accessibility aid, and confusion at poll sites also, with poll workers giving different instructions, sometimes diverging from the law. And these issues matter not just because they're inconvenient or problematic. For many voters, they're simply obstacles that cannot be overcome, whether you're a worker who cannot afford to wait online for hours, or somebody who does not have the privilege and power to overcome obstacles that are violations of federal and state voting law in many instances. So we've run into too many of these problems over and over again, which leads us to the big question that brings us all here today. Why do these problems keep happening? They're no secret. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers experience them cycle after cycle. What is wrong with the way the elections are run, and what will it take to fix them?
That is the burning question. What is it going to take to fix them? And part of, I believe, the root cause of this problem is the politics of election administration. Assemblymember Rozic, I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we take the politics, or as Courtney Gross said, the patronage out of election administration so that we get to some of the root cause problems?
That's a great question, Dorna. And it gets at the heart of what our bill does in separating out the executive directors from the commissionerships, and really delineating and making sure that people have the right expertise, that they have the right qualifications, they have the skills and knowledge that they need in order to run our elections, and to take politics completely out of that. So it really empowers executive directors to do the right thing, to do right by voters, and to understand that the old vestiges, the old patronage systems of years past just doesn't work in a modern society in running our modern elections. So we've been working hard on drafting it. Senator Krueger and I had a hearing about this, I think last December at this point, trying to get everyone on the same page in pushing this legislation forward.
Just because the question came up in the chat, I want to level set for everybody. What's our current system, right? Can we just assume that all of us don't know what the system currently is as it relates to bipartisanship and whether it could be nonpartisan?
So it's a great question about nonpartisan versus bipartisan. And some of it is actually requirements in the state constitution that would actually need to be changed to move into a nonpartisan model. But we do believe that legislatively we can make really significant improvements in how the Board of Election is operated. So Nily pointed out that there's staff and then there are the commissioners. There are 10 commissioners in the New York City Board of Election, 1 D and 1 R from each borough. And they seem to have a disproportionate amount of the power over the policies and the operations of the Board of Election. So we've handed all the key issues of how do you get an election run to a fairly large, and certainly I think overly large, group of people to fight it out in a partisan manner. They end up making the decisions about who runs the agency, the Board of Election, who has the senior positions. There are serious questions about the qualifications of the current senior staff at the Board of Elections, because we have no standards for job requirements, no training, no listed announcements of jobs for people to apply for, no descriptions of the jobs that you're applying for and then how you get them, because those all seem to be done in a partisan and a complicated way through 10 commissioners. So what our bill would do is to modernize the agency's operations to look more like the rest of government agencies, where there are qualifications for the people on top, there are job descriptions, there's actual training to make sure that people meet the qualifications, and if they don't have them, they can learn them in order to keep their jobs. It would still keep a structure of Ds and Rs in a bipartisan way, operating the agency, but we believe that with standards for the hiring of the senior people not being controlled by the commissioners, and by shrinking the number of commissioners, we will see a significant improvement in how the elections are run. And those decisions get made at every level. You know, who gets the contract to do what? Why is that a partisan decision by commissioners as opposed to, say, a request for proposal model that most government agencies use, and you bid on them and you are evaluated as to whether you meet the criteria of the RFP and then you're awarded? Not, you know, the Republicans really like this company, the Democrats really like that company. That shouldn't be how we make decisions about the equipment for elections. That certainly shouldn't be how we make decisions about how we are going to count elections afterwards, or whether or not we're going to decide standards of recounts. We have requirements for recounts in certain kinds of elections that are close. But right now, the local boards can decide whether they're doing it manually, maybe they're hiring some company to count it with equipment. Are we really just auditing a subsection? What are we doing? Those can be laid out as specific requirements and standards of the agency that are followed, and not are decided when something blows up with 10 partisan commissioners getting in the room. Very often, if you ask people who follow this, in executive session, so that no one is welcome to watch and see the meetings, even though they're open meeting laws that are supposed to be followed. But many people have told us of the executive session being the only actual meetings of these 10.
The room where it happens, you might say, right? And I think that's the problem with the current state of affairs in election administration. I want to get the Deputy Public Advocate in this conversation. And we heard, right, the root cause of the problem. Tell us more about how this then affects or can become a form of voter suppression and how it impacts historically marginalized communities. So come on in, Xamayla, and tell us some more in that specific lane.
Sure, thanks for that question. And first, thank you for inviting me to this panel with these amazing women. Oftentimes when people think about voter suppression, I think the vision or the imagery that often comes to mind, you think about the Deep South, you think about racial tensions, you think about people being barred from going to poll sites and not being able to vote, and some of the things that we've read about in history, and some things that we're actually seeing reoccurring now across the country, even as like additional I think more than 400 bills have been introduced to kind of suppress votes in marginalized communities. But really, voter suppression is really just the act of making it harder for someone to vote. Even if they're able to cast their ballot, if they have to jump through hoops and scale barriers and do all these sorts of things just to express their franchise and go to the poll site and vote, then that's voter suppression. So how we see this play out in modern day is we can see that in like how we look at early voting. For instance, just last the 20th, which was the last general election, in my own poll site, you would think as deputy public advocate, I should just have a breeze. It was 5 hours to vote. I went to vote 3 times and actually I left. I wasn't turned away, but I left because I just could not stand there for 5 hours. I think eventually I ended up voting on the general election day. And that's because in my particular poll site, there were probably more than 150,000 people assigned to that poll site, which was inequitable in comparison to many other poll sites across the city who had less than 100,000. So that is a form of a barrier to voting. That happened to happen during the early voting period. But if we say that early voting is supposed to assist elections and make it easier and give people choice and people flexibility, especially working parents, people who may have non-traditional jobs and things like that, then we have to make sure that we're also lifting the cap for the minimum, because even though the city does not have enough sites, they're still meeting the requirement of the law. So we really do need to expand like early voting if we really want to increase participation. Part of it is like voter registration. People often talk about that, like we need to get people registered to vote, but the truth is we have tons of people registered to vote who just struggle, to make it to the poll site on election day and throughout early voting. Other ways that we could see voter suppression play out is in like last minute changes. I do remember there was an election, I believe it was like a year or two ago, our office was contacted. There were some changes to poll sites at the very last minute. We had to intervene. We had to get in touch with the Board of Elections and ask if they had already notified the voters in those areas that the poll sites had been changed. It then triggered, an automatic response. They were able to reach out, but these things shouldn't happen that way. It shouldn't be such a case by case or a one-off. It needs to be more streamlined. There needs to be standards. And so like the public advocate, and we all agree that the bills that have been crafted in Albany by Senator Krueger and Assemblywoman Rozic, that's part of the solution to these problems. There's so many other things, including paid postage for ballots. If people don't have the resources to buy a stamp and they can't get to the poll site, then how do they cast their vote? And so these are some of the ways that we see voter suppression playing out in modern day New York City.
I think, that is it, right? Like you just put a face on it, and I want to invite Chisun to share more context if she has them around poor election administration and how that is a form of voter suppression. What's interesting is like all of those things will happen. I bet every single one of us on this call can tell a bad election story, and then guess what happens? You leave the poll site and you forget all about it. So this isn't like the top headline, right? I like to call myself a democracy ninja. And even my own husband was standing in line with me saying, why don't we pay more money or spend more time focusing on election administration? And I was like, hi, I'm your wife. That's what I do, right? I advocate for democracy. And so Chisun, tell us more, right? Like, are there other things that Xamayla didn't cover that really put a shine a light on what voter suppression could look like when you have poorly administered elections?
Yeah, I think that it's important to really sit with the cost of poor election administration, what this means for the individual who is disenfranchised. I mean, ultimately deprived of their fundamental right to vote. I think sometimes the terminology of long lines and confusion, that sort of thing, conceals the fact that people are being deprived of their right to vote. You shouldn't have to clear 5 hours from your working day in order to be able to cast a ballot that counts. And we found that what's happening in New York matters hugely in a couple of ways. I mean, to New Yorkers themselves. Also, we know we're in a moment right now nationally where voter suppression is a deliberate thing in some parts of this country. And no one here is saying that that's happening deliberately in New York City. But places where there are repressive voting laws on the books and bills being considered in state houses right now can point to New York City and say, well, we're not trying to do anything differently than New York City. Our record is no worse. So we've got to fix that for sure, because these problems are affecting us New Yorkers and also helping to feed a narrative of, I think, low expectations And we have to think about the New Yorkers who run into problems one year and then they don't come back the next year because it's too hard to do their basic, exercise their basic right as a citizen to show up and vote.
So well said, Chisun, and I think that's right? We don't want to discourage people, especially I think about it from a perspective of first-time voters and young voters of like, if this is how much work it takes to cast a vote and make my voice heard, why am I doing it? I want to come over to the assembly member just to jump in on the point of accountability and what's at stake when you don't have an accountable election administration system.
Yeah, and I think that that's like the other flip side of the coin as well. Like we have in the last couple of years created all this election reform and no real accountability when it comes to actual implementation. So that is also part of our bill, and really requires that when we're choosing these executive directors, that the mayor, the public advocate, and the speaker of the city council in a majority vote actually find someone who will be accountable to them. And when that goes awry, as has happened in so many different election cycles, that there is accountability built into the system from the get-go, and that there's a removal process when things go wrong and people need to kind of have a refresher course or do better or maybe not do the job at all. So I think that that's a really key piece to the legislation as well.
Absolutely, right? That's the word. What's the phrase? Good legislation goes to die when no one's enforcing it or making sure it's being held accountable. I want to think about what are the consequences, right? Like we dug in a little bit, but I want to know, are there things we're missing, right? When we think about what could be better, are there other solutions that we should be considering? You've started to highlight some of them, all of you, and I want to bring Senator Krueger back into the conversation. When we think about solutions, you have pending legislation at the state level. Are those the only solutions? Are there other solutions? And then what's the will to do that amongst the state legislature? Because this conversation comes up time and again, right? To Chisun's point, people wag their fingers at New York like, oh, you're the progressive capital of the world or the country? Then fix your elections, right? So like, how do we do this?
All right, so in our defense, on behalf of the legislature, over the last 2 years, we passed a significant number of voting reforms that people such as Chisun, who spend their lives looking at this, will, I hope, agree were really significant voting reform improvements for New York State. And they passed both houses and were signed by the governor. And I'll use as an example, early voting as one of the really key wins we had, where now people have an ability to go and vote in person over a 10-day period, not just on election day. And even though there have been problems with some of the early voting sites, without enough of them in certain communities and, understaffed, not hours that were not the hours people expected them to be, etc., it has dramatically improved access. Now, of course, we were doing this at the same time as COVID, where everyone was told, don't go near anyone, don't go out in public. So we also expanded on a temporary basis, expanded eligibility to do absentee voting. And we have more legislation to move us further down that road because, hardly shocking, more people can vote if they actually get an application in the mail and fill it out and get the ballot and fill it out and mail it back or deliver it to a voting box somewhere without the need to stand in line at all in any location. So we've done some of those things. We have streamlined the process for where you can register and how you can register to vote. I don't know that we're 100% there on online voter registration, but we're trying to get there. We have seen expanded eligibility for people coming out of prisons and getting back their right to vote. We have, I should have pulled the long list of laws we actually have changed in the last 2 years. And when I say these were significant changes, I'll just point out, I've been in the Senate almost 20 years. For the first 18 years, we didn't do any voter reforms, nothing, nada. And so the fact that for the last 2 years, And I will point out a reason they've gotten done is because we have Democrats in control of both the Senate and the Assembly, and we can get bills passed both houses and signed into law, which is a very exciting change of storyline. So I do believe we are continuing that path, and I expect, I know neither Nily or I can speak for our houses, but I will tell you that the Senate is very optimistic that we're going to start off our January session with an additional group of election reform bills. Because again, our elections committee has just finished, I think, 5 or 6 hearings on election issues around the state. And I know that my colleagues in the Senate and Senator Myrie have a long agenda of things that they want to continue to move on come the new session year. And again, I never speak for the Assembly, but I do want to applaud them for the equivalent momentum in moving election reform bills over the 2 years we've just finished.
That's inspiring, and it gives us some hope to look forward to. I bet Dr. Dukes, who's been in this fight for democracy reform and making sure that we have equitable election administration policies, would agree with some of the reforms that have been passed already, and I bet has her own long list of reforms that she'd like to see going forward. I don't want to put her on the spot immediately, so I'll turn the question over to Xamayla a little bit, just to think about, there are also unique challenges we faced during the pandemic, right? Senator Krueger raised the point of like, you can't go near someone. So, well, how do you get the registration done, or how do you vote in person? And so I'd be curious to hear any solutions you might propose to address how we continue to have effectively run elections in the middle of a pandemic.
Just like Senator Krueger said, a lot of that work already started. One of the ones that I like to point to and highlight when I think about New York City being a little more progressive and moving on reform is the fact that because we moved from the normal process of just voting in person to doing a vote by mail absentee ballots, we saw a significant increase in the number of people who were doing absentee ballots, and it was overwhelming. And as part of that, we also saw a lot of ballots get rejected, tens of thousands of ballots across New York State, not just in New York City. And the legislature moved after that to implement a ballot curing process where, ballots can then, the people who casted their ballots can then be contacted, and those can be corrected. That way their votes can count. So that's like pretty much what our state can continue to do, things like that to move in the right direction. And then of course, a language access issue that we have in New York City, where of course we have so many diverse constituencies and we speak hundreds of languages here. However, only a few of them are actually in the law in terms of the interpretation that we have to provide. So we do need some more assistance from the state legislature, as well as from the Board of Elections, on providing that language access for those who need it. So those are some of the things that we think are really important, specifically for New York City, just because of the demographic that we serve and that we have living here.
And I want to ask this question both to Assemblymember Rozic, but also give Dr. Dukes a chance to get in the conversation too. All of that is great, right? And this goes back to the accountability point. How do we ensure that the Board of Elections in New York City is prepared to then implement these laws successfully, right? Without I forget the exact word Senator Krueger used, but expose that might come out 2 days after the election. Like what needs to happen at the local level to ensure these good laws are implemented well?
First of all, thank you for waiting for me. Technology is good on some time and not in others. We had a problem in the building. I had to get the building people to get involved in this. Let me just say that one of the things that we talk about, we have not given enough attention to reform. It takes resources. We've not given enough resources. Training, we have not given adequate training to those persons. I just heard this morning that New Jersey is going from $200 to $300 for their workers. I think that you're right, Link Gresham. I've been fighting this fight for so long, I get kind of weary some days, and then I really think about democracy, and so I get my spirit back up. The training that we have provided, the pay that we give to people to expect them to work long hours. One of the things that I've said, we ought to have shifts. No one should be up at 4 o'clock in the morning to open up a voting place at 6 o'clock and then stay, and somebody might bring them a cold sandwich or some water. That's inhumane in a way. So we need to look at that. When we had early voting, the lines were long. We didn't have enough locations open. All of those things hinder citizens from wanting to participate in reform. I agree with Senator Krueger. We can't piecemeal this. We can't piecemeal voter reform any longer. We got to come with a plan that encompasses all of these things, from resources to professionals to training. All of this have to be if we're going to really reform our system.
Assemblymember Rozic, what more would you add, if anything?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, the only real way to have reform and then to have accountability is to make sure that from poll workers all the way up the food chain to executive directors, they have the appropriate training and then the appropriate evaluation, right? So that we're correcting or refreshing people's knowledge about how to run and administer elections.
And how much of what both you and Dr. Dukes proposed can be implemented now versus needs legislation to get done, right? Because I've heard we need to professionalize the Board of Elections. We need to make sure there's training, there's pay, appropriate compensation for poll workers. Like, how much of that is a today solution versus we need the legislature back in session to address it?
That's right now. I think that if we give the resources and we get training, I think we can do a better job even for this coming election and educate our citizens. I mean, I am so glad that DemocracyNYC, no one really is lifting up the initiatives that's going to be on this ballot. It's almost like ranked choice voting. I guess everybody will start talking 3 days before the election. That's not enough time, even for seasoned voters. So that's not going to reform. If we're going to have these things on the ballot, why not begin the day after the election? The last election, we saw what happened with ranked choice voting. We saw, as the other speaker panelists before me said, how many ballots were lost, how long it took us to know. Even California laughed at us. They said it shouldn't take 6 weeks to find out who is elected. So it points to us.
Chisun, I want to bring you back into the conversation because Dr. Dukes raised the point of like us being the laughing stock of other reformers. What are some of the other reforms that we should be looking to that are happening around the country, right? That New York could be implementing here as well.
Yeah, thank you. And first, to Senator Krueger's earlier point about the tremendous progress the state has made in updating its voting laws, that's absolutely true. But I definitely wanted to give the huge credit where it's due to the Let New York Vote Coalition, many of the leaders I see in the chat. There was a lot of momentum and leadership in Albany. There was also a lot of momentum and leadership among the grassroots, among Let New York Vote members and Fair Elections for New York members. And so together, I think we've seen a lot of changes in substantive voting policy. But as you're asking, DeNora, why haven't things drastically improved as much as we could all reasonably expect now that we've got updated voting laws? So something that the Brennan Center recently did in a report we published last month was look around the country, because we know, because we work on election administration and voting issues everywhere, this is not an easy business. It's challenging. Circumstances change all the time. Everybody across the country saw that during the pandemic. Still, New York City keeps measuring up very poorly compared to similar large, diverse metropolitan jurisdictions around the country. So we wanted to find out what is uniquely wrong with New York City. One of them, as the senator pointed out earlier, was this 10 commissioner structure spread across the 5 counties. And we're just talking about New York City here, although there are significant problems across the state. No other bipartisan board serving a place as big as New York City has that kind of huge decision-making structure. They're all 3 to 5 members. One of them has 6. So just the sheer number of votes it takes to move forward on basic election administration decisions is obviously inefficient. And you asked a few times about accountability, DeNora. We have a structure that we found to also to be unique among large election jurisdictions around the country, where ultimately only the governor holds the power to remove a commissioner even after huge problems that end up disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of voters. So one of our recommendations would be to get in line with other parts of the country that are similar to New York and put accountability closer to the voters with locally elected officials who are directly accountable to the voters who experience these problems. And then some of the best practices that the lawmakers and others have brought up here are basic and in place in other parts of the country. Public job postings, training requirements, not just for poll workers, but also for leadership at the top, who sets the policy, determines the rules. All of these things sound basic, but they're missing in New York. And things like this are present in other parts of the country that do it better. And all of the things that I've just mentioned are achievable through, I'm not saying it's politically easy, I'm not the expert on this panel about that, but they are achievable through regular state legislation, short of a constitutional amendment process. So yeah, there are plenty of other lessons from other parts of the country that have handled similarly diverse, populous areas better, and some of the answers are basic.
That's super, both inspiring, but also provides good context. I saw a question in the chat a little bit earlier about how do we secure voter privacy in future elections? And I'm just curious, Senator Krueger or Assemblymember Rozic, if that's something that you all have spoke about at the state legislature and proposed solutions regarding.
So I know that I spoke to a specific researcher who had brought to the attention of the New York Times the fact that researchers are able to figure out who voted for whom if there's a tiny number of registered voters in an EDAD. And that certainly, I think, concerned many of us when we saw that story. And again, it turns out it's always been that way, but only for a small number of election districts if there's a very small number of registered voters. So I asked her what the solution was, and she said that the census ends up with the same problem, because your census data is also supposed to be non-identifiable to you, and that what the census did was they grouped EDs together in a larger batch if there were fewer than X number of people in them. And that was her recommendation for the state of New York as well. So I have not had the chance to have the conversation with my full legislative body yet, because I just had the chance to meet with her the other day. But it seemed like a very simple and easy solution for us if we just go down that road and follow the model of the census to protect the privacy right to vote. If there are other examples where people think their privacy has been violated, I think we would need, to really look into that. There was one question in the chat that I'm reading as I talk to you about people going to re-register their driver's license, I believe, and finding that somehow they were removed from being a registered party affiliate in their voting registration. So I think we need to look into that one. I don't know whether that was intentional or not, because I think we do all, in general, support that when you go to apply for a driver's license or some other government benefit, you should have the right to register to vote at the same time using the same materials. but I don't think any of us ever intended there to be a situation where you would suddenly lose your party affiliation if you went down that path. So whoever put that in chat, if you have more details to share, that would be actually helpful so that I could understand what I'm trying to ask in getting to the bottom of that one.
You're making my work as a moderator much easier, Senator Krueger. I appreciate you for lifting up that question in the chat.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I know there are a couple of other questions that have been included in the chat, including one directed at you, Chisun, if you feel comfortable answering it around. So it says, there's been some discussion of adding a single independent nonpartisan commissioner to the New York City Board of Elections. And the Brennans, they're quoting your report, so that's good. The Brennan Center noted in its recent report that this can be done in a manner consistent with the state constitution. You've touched on this a little bit before, but would you mind expanding upon this and what you have in mind with respect to the composition?
Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry for neglecting the question. I have trouble keeping up with all the things happening on my screen right now.
That's why I'm here. I'm keeping track of all the things.
Yes, it's a great question. There are hundreds of thousands of stakeholders in that question. So, and the Brennan Center is still talking with all our allies in the coalition, lawmakers. So I'm hardly going to say, here is the answer and the magic composition. What I can say is that the state constitution does leave room for what the questioner is proposing. It's actually, conventional wisdom, and I think political wisdom has been that the state constitution has this very hefty bipartisan requirement. But when you actually look at the constitution, it limits the bipartisan representation requirement to certain limited functions: registering voters, distributing ballots, and canvassing, like counting the votes, are in the Constitution. The need to be equally represented between the two top vote-getting parties in the state. And then it's state legislation, regular statute, that has expanded upon that to create a lot of process for essentially what we see today, which is the two major parties in the state largely controlling the leadership and staffing of the local boards of election. But what we see today is not required by the state constitution. And I think the questioner may be getting at an idea that we've heard that does not seem barred by the Constitution, where you could have bipartisan balance and still a nonpartisan member that doesn't disturb the bipartisan balance. It's an interesting question, and one that I know, we're discussing all the time with our allies in the Let New York Vote Coalition, and listening to voters all over the state about what issues could be addressed through that sort of change.
Thanks for that, Chisun. And then another question from the chat. An interesting question, futuristic or maybe current question is, New York State has been in the vanguard of creating ways to track your vaccination status via app. And how far in the future do we think electronic voting is by device? And is that something that we know to be in discussion already by the Board of Election?
I think that would require legislative change, and certainly tracking, the information about, are you registered? Can you register? Did you get your ballot in the mail? Did your ballot show up again? If you send it back in the mail, have you voted? Just for you to know and make sure that your vote counted. I like all of that. Actual electronic voting, only speaking for myself, I could only be comfortable with that if someone can really prove to me that electronic voting could be guaranteed to be hack proof and would have an audit trail mechanism so that we could check afterwards, did everybody's vote get counted and counted the way they intended it to be? I get more than a little nervous about the hacking capabilities pretty much of anyone over the age of 14 in today's world with the computer technologies. And so Again, maybe I'm just old-fashioned, but I love having an audit trail and even a paper audit trail where somebody says, I think that election wasn't added up correctly, and I think I can prove it. You know what? We can all take a look and we can all prove it. So I may be out of the mainstream on this one. I don't know.
I don't think you out of the mainstream. I think that I agree with you about being able to make sure that every vote is counted and everybody's there. I think what we must do, and I don't think it takes constitutional amendment, we must go back to doing what we know we need to do in this state and in this city. That is the resources, that's the training, and that's the availability of persons. If today New Jersey is saying, I'm going from 2 to 3, we've been talking about this. We don't pay enough for people to do this work. We need to look at shift. Why don't we have people who open up at 4, get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and be ready at 6 o'clock? Why are they not going at 2 or 3 o'clock? Then bring on another shift. At another shift, we would have more productivity from our workers. These are the things that we just need common sense to prevail, and people not sitting doing nothing at a front desk talking and having a good time. We need to make sure that the productivity and what we want from our citizens to encourage them to be involved in democracy, we can do that now. We can do that now.
I agree with Madam Duke. Yes.
We can do those things now. I mean, I've been talking about them at least 20 years, and so nothing happened. Why do we have people 4 o'clock in the morning leaving from their home to come to a place to be open at 6, and then they stay there till 9 or 10 all day? Why? We don't do that in other professionals. We don't do that for medical facilities. I mean, come on. It's just common sense. And
I just wanted to, oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
I'll my soapbox, right, thank you. You go on.
No, I actually just wanted to chime in on something that was being said before that, but I completely agree with you. We really do need to look at shifts and how people are trained and poll workers are administrating that work. The comment that I just wanted to make, it was actually more of a fun one than anything else. You know, when we were talking about electronic voting and elections, and I do think that there's room for us to do a little bit more research. Right now, it's completely insecure from like everything that we've heard and some of the research that we've done in our office. We've been hearing some really interesting things about using blockchain as a potential avenue, but of course that's something that would just need to be looked into. But I think more importantly, if we're talking about BOE reform and we're talking about what can we do right now in this day and age, a big technical hurdle that we have right now is voting centers. Right? And that's definitely something that we need to look into. There's been conversations had, the law has already passed to allow us to have voting centers to kind of be on the same page with other states all across the country. Yet still, we have not been able to implement that in New York City. And it's actually just a barrier to voting. We were talking about voter suppression earlier in this conversation, and it's not allowing us to use a tool that other people are using that can make the process of casting our ballots much, much easier. And it's really a little technical glitch, something that can be solved, but something that really there needs to be more effort and more political will in order for us to get that done. And hopefully we can have it done by next year's primary.
Thank you for that. And I know that Carol is going to come back soon and she's going to take the mic back from me. So I want to end on a positive note. I want us to think about and dream big about how we're going to get the average person, everyday New Yorkers, to care about free, fair, and equitable elections every day, and not just on election day or not just when they read the expose. And so I want to quickly round robin and get everybody to give me some words of inspiration before Carol comes back. And I'm going to start first with you, Assemblymember Rozic. She's like, why? Why'd you start with me?
No, it's good. I have a good answer. The answer is call your legislators today or email them today. We'll drop into the chat the number of the legislation that Liz and I sponsor, but we need more co-sponsors. We need people, especially in the assembly, to show that there's a groundswell of support for this. It's going to be an uphill battle, especially on my end, and I'm very real about that. And you know, the only way we change democracy is doing it together, and I really need people to weigh in with their local legislators.
Thank you. Senator Krueger, what advice would you add to that?
I would agree. You should lobby us in the legislature and hold us accountable. You should actually, when we get the new mayor after this election, we need to have serious conversations with him about making sure he has a real commitment to
Right.
expanding and improving voter access in the city of New York. You know, there's actually been a lot of work done in this administration. That's why we actually have the great Laura Wood, who has the best title on earth. She's like in charge of democracy or something for New York City. Not a bad title, but that we have more people working on these issues, because let's be honest, we lose out on our democracy. People give up on trying to vote. People think their vote doesn't count. People stop showing up. We've really flunked all of the tests. So there's almost endless things you could do. I guess I'll give a promo then too. There's great organizations that are sponsoring this event today and speaking at this event, and everybody should know about them and the work they're doing. Personally, I've used the Brennan Center reports for years to look at my government and hold it up under a microscope compared to other states and go, damn, how come we're not there? Why are we always the punchline of Brennan Center reports? And the women creating change. I mean, you know, we really can change the world individually and together. So please don't give up on this issue.
Perfect. Chisun and Xamayla, I want to quickly bring you in, but the last word is going to go to Dr. Dukes on this because she's been working tirelessly at it the longest. So please share your thoughts as well.
Thank you so much, the icon that's been working on these things. Thank you, Senator, for lifting up Laura and her group. We've had a great relationship. I must give them a big shout out because they really not only talked about it, but they put resources into ranked choice voting. And it wasn't their problem that we did not do all we wanted to do, because they really put their hearts. She and her staff worked diligently, because I was a part of that with them, from radio announcements to flyers to posters. I think you're right, Senator Krueger. I talked to my community and some of them said, look, I'm just sick and tired of all these things you all say, but yet when I get to the polls, I don't find friendliness. I don't find people who are able to assist me. The books, the rolls are crazy, even after people, we push people to change their address, even if they go from one floor to another floor. And when you get to the voting place where you are, it's not there. And so I'm gonna hop on training and resources. We must do that, and we don't need a constitutional amendment. We can do that today. And please believe me, Senator, I will be knocking on the door of the new mayor, whoever he or she is, when they come in. It's two he's now. When they come in to do better in New York City, and you know that I walked the halls in Albany ever since you've been there and before you got there. So I'll be doing all of that continuously. And I see that Claire Theobald and a lot of my NAACP people are on today as we start preparing for our 2022 agenda.
And I'll just add one thing, as what people can do. There are some great coalitions that were already mentioned: Common Cause, Let New York Vote Coalition, Smart Elections. If you're really interested in election technology, I would advise that people get involved in some of those coalitions if they're interested in urging policymakers on BOE reform. And also, at the end of the day, if you see something, say something, reach out to your elected officials. Our office is also available, the Public Advocate's Office. You can also reach us at gethelp@advocate.nyc.gov.
Yeah, I would just echo exactly that. Get involved, sign up with the Let New York Vote Coalition, which is open to any and all voters who are interested and want to follow along. And I think we all just need to keep doing the work and keeping the faith that change is possible. New York State has come a long way in just a few years on voting, including 2 constitutional amendment campaigns that are going to be on the ballot this year for enabling same-day voter registration and enabling no excuse mail voting. So even the hard things are possible. And thanks so much for including us in this conversation.
Well, it's definitely been my pleasure to be in conversation with all of you all. It gave me good feelings again to be with the New York City and New York State democracy reformers. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate this timely and hopefully last of its kind conversation about some of the election administration reform we need. And with that, I'll pass it over to Carol to close us out.
Thank you so much, DeNora. And I want to thank all of you. Wow, this was an amazing conversation, not surprising given the background of all of you and all that you bring to the table. So I want to thank you, DeNora, for leading us through this conversation and really for helping us to decode it a little bit. This, you know, I'm amazed there were over 120 people on this conversation at one point, and you know, that so many people are interested in this topic really says a lot. I'm hoping this will be the first of many conversations we all have together as a group. Certainly many conversations have come before, and we still need to, now we need to move on it, not just keep having conversations. I also really want to thank our panelists. You all are amazing leaders in this space, and it really is so great that you were able to set aside some time to have this important conversation. I also want to thank our partners at DemocracyNYC. Laura, you're an amazing partner, and we're really lucky and privileged to work with you. And also those 120 plus people that were on. There are a lot of questions we didn't get to, which is another reason we really want to keep this conversation very much going and moving into action. As I said, you really helped us to decode a lot of the conversation that was happening. One of the things that sort of comes up for me is us really moving forward on some common sense legislation. I think that's what we're all about, is really being able to do something that makes sense. And I think what the senator and the assemblywoman have laid out is really great. And it's also really great to have organizations like the Brennan Center really pushing us, really helping us to understand what's not working and what we really need to be doing. And we're very thankful here in New York City that we have so much talent. And then somebody like Dr. Dukes, who's been in this space for a long time, we learn from you every day, and it's great to have your voice very front and center with us. Something that Senator Krueger said early on were these 2 notions about access being a key element and also being counted. And the whole notion of us not piecemealing this, this is a comprehensive effort that takes a lot of hands. And that's why the participants and all of you and all the other players out there are really key to making this happen. And the place I want to land us on is sort of, where do we go from here? At Women Creating Change, we're very focused on action, as all of you are. So we talked about the legislation. We got to move it. And in order to move it, all of us and all of the people that we work with have to reach out. As the Assemblywoman and the Senator said, they need to hear from all of us that this is something important. In the short term, there is a lot that we can actually do. Longer term, yes, we need to look at our Constitution. There are things we know we need to change, and that will be part of a longer effort. So let's make those calls. Another thing that came up today was also about these great coalitions that are out there. We're a member, we're Women Creating Change, are members of the Let New York Vote Coalition. There are many other coalitions out there who are doing amazing work. Let's all join them. Let's find out what they're doing. They have a lot of events and campaigns happening, and we can all join that. We at Women Creating Change will make sure all of you who participated today will get a follow-up email this week. We're going to include the coalitions. We're going to include the bill. We're going to include ways, if people don't know how to contact their electeds, ways that people can contact their electeds. We're going to have opportunities and events. We mentioned earlier today, Senator Krueger is involved in a town hall happening tonight. That was in the chat. I have to tell you, I signed up during this, so I'll see you there tonight.
Tomorrow night.
Oh, tomorrow night. Thank you for that. So there's a lot happening and there's a lot that needs to happen. And I just want to, as we close this out, just thank everybody for the tremendous leadership. We happen to be all women on this chat today, and it's pretty powerful. I think what women can do. We're also happy to have the men who participated in the conversation today. But I want to thank all of you, and we'll look forward to very much remaining in touch, taking action, and really seeing this happen. Not down the road, but very soon. But thank you all for being a part of today's conversation. Be well.
Hey.